let's just go ahead, rip the Band-Aid off, show you the most ridiculous thing I've ever found on this show. What? 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 So normally I only look at stuff out of bounds, but in order to look at everything out of bounds, I can also just call in everything that is in each chapter into the game world. And when I was doing that to find stuff out of bounds, like I said, I found this. And once I found out which folder this animation was from, there was another character in the same folder that you can also call in. So then I found this. Oh no. No, that can't be right. It is right in the sense that yes, that character model is supposed to be there. That wasn't intentional, right? It was intentional. This character is in the same folder and it's meant to be Anya getting a lap dance from Curly. That's not supposed to happen. Okay, maybe that's not supposed to happen, but obviously it's one of the most absurd developer gags I've ever seen, ever. And it felt wrong to be the only person reacting to this, so I brought in a good friend of the channel, Vinny Vinesauce, to see what he thought before I published this episode.
What am I looking at? Well, this certainly puts an end to all the people complaining about the fan creations. I don't know if this increases my enjoyment. No, it doesn't. I'm just going to put it out of my mind as soon as we're done here. But wow, that is actually shocking that that's in the game.
All right, well, on that note, welcome to another episode of an ongoing series where we basically take the camera anywhere we want to try to find secrets and new discoveries to some of our favorite games. And today we're going to be covering Mouthwashing. Not only are we going to be covering Mouthwashing, but we're also going to be using a camera made by Jade, not the no-clip camera that all of you know about. This one's made from the ground up so we can look at even more stuff out of bounds. And we're also going to have one of the developers on to answer some of the questions of some of the stuff that I found. And let me tell you, there was stuff that was definitely found, so let's jump into that. In the chapter where you find a working cryo chamber, if you take the camera behind one of the non-working cryo chambers, you can find another Easter egg. You got yourself 2 of the Pony Express mascots sitting around eating a piece of meat on a plate with 2 cups. Very, very cute, kind of. Except knowing what that meat is, it's not cute anymore. Now, as you know, the resolution in this game is set to very, very low for aesthetic reasons, but as a result, a lot of the details in this game become impossible to see. One of the best examples is this monitor here in the cockpit. If you take the camera up to the screen and start reading what's written here, you can see that it says, now let's write something important. Have you ever considered how useful umbrellas are? They're fashionable, protects you from rain, and can be pretty cute too. I wish I knew who invented them. Do you think they're famous? I could look it up, but I won't. You do it if you want. If you haven't realized by now, this text is useless garbage that doesn't mean anything. It's not meant to be read, just filler text. But that won't stop me from wishing you a good day. On the off chance that you're even actually able to read this, I wish you good things. I hope you're doing well. Whether your day is ending or it's just beginning, I hope it is good. I'm just writing until the screen is full. I should have done the Lorem Ipsum thing, and I'm starting to regret that I didn't. Is it too late to start now? And then the rest of it is, in fact, in Lorem Ipsum. Except for the very end where it says, quote the Raven. And we're still not done with Easter eggs. In Chapter 2, if we take the camera underneath the map and go all the way over here, you can find a picture of some sort of creature. And it wasn't until I did a little bit of digging that I found out this is a character from another Wrong Oregon game called How Fish is Made. In fact, if you go to the Steam page for the game, you can see a little gif of him dancing right here. Next up is the scene where you find the TV in the warehouse, and if you zoom the camera out, there's a cool looking pattern to the boxes and how they're structured and everything. Also, I Fulbrighted the floor here so that you can see the texture of the floor better, but more importantly than that, somebody's legs are sticking out of the environment, and it's none other than Curly. Now, why is Curly's legs sticking out of the ground? Well, that's because Curly has a little Easter egg that the player can find in-game. If you go over to this part of the environment, you can get spooked by Curly. And not only that, if you take the camera out of bounds now, you can see that Curly is humongous. And there's also a developer cube that's hidden underneath this map that is tied to the coding of this section. So this next one is really special. It's the title screen of the game, and when you pan the camera out normally, you could see another version of the panel that shows the sunset. But like I exampled earlier in this episode, if you start putting things back into the map that is supposed to be for this particular scene, you could see a completely unused title screen. Now my question is, why did you make a whole separate title screen when you already had one here? Granted, it doesn't look like it's fully modeled, but still, it looked like they were on their way to something, so I ended up asking the developer, Jeffrey Tomek.
Yeah, so we used to have this whole like diegetic menu concept for the game where Curly's whole setup with all the screens and stuff would be laid vertically. So we'd have like, you know, all the kind of medical equipment stack you would have like on attached to like the IV thing and the little card and all that stuff. And so that was going to be a big stack. It was going to have this set of like 4 screens. They would have the different menu buttons on them. And if you select any of those things, the camera would zoom into that and show like the more specific options. Like, you know, it would zoom into the options menu screen and then the actual menu would appear inside that. The reason we cut it was both just like scope, like it was just complicated, but also we're running the game at 640p, which is actually pretty low resolution wise, and text that appears in 3D space can become very hard to read very quickly. So mapping something like diegetically like that ends up being a big problem.
And in one of the last few scenes of this game, you get this part where you're just dropping through here, and there's trees, and then there's like graves. It happens all so quickly though. But what's really cool is that if you take the camera over here, you can see inside the casket, and inside the casket is Daisuke, which obviously you don't get to see Daisuke inside this casket. Not only are you moving way too fast to ever be able to catch that, but secondly, the casket's completely closed in, so you wouldn't be able to see his body. But on top of that, when you get to the graveyard scene, every single casket that's in this scene has Daisuke inside of it as well. And speaking of Daisuke, we're going to do another close-up of the character's face because, again, the game's resolution is really low, and so you might not think to take the camera right up to it to see how different it is from the regular Daisuke. In fact, now we're on the topic of looking at character models, like, for example, Curly before the accident. There's not a lot of times where this character model is used, and even when it does, you don't get to see the entire character model in one shot. So one thing I really wanted to do is show the shoes. I know that sounds weird, but like all the characters have different shoes in this game, and Curly's is never shown to the player. So in this instance, you can see that Curly's shoes appear to be men's Uggs. Wasn't expecting that, but yeah, well, there you go. And again, these pairs of shoes are different from every other characters in the game. And we'll get to one other pair of shoes in a second. But also, if you take the camera inside of Curly after the accident, you can see that the eye will follow you no matter where you go. So in no clip, if you take the camera into the back of his head, for example, the eye will actually shift around to look at you. Also, if you thought that Anya just looked like Shelley Duvall by coincidence, if you take the camera over to the shelf of books, you can see that one of them says Stories from Overlook Hotel, which is a reference to The Shining, because the hotel that they stay at is the Overlook Hotel. Also, a detail you might have missed is that if you looked at this corkboard, there are a couple of sticky notes that have little doodles on them, some of which are for the Pony Express. And then there's one here that's really strange. It says Yimpy with a very unfortunate looking face drawn. But I've distracted you long enough. I know, you're all on the edge of your seat to see more shoes. So Swansea has a pair of sneakers, and they actually have a logo on them. Apparently these shoes are called Tilbs, Tilbs, which is really neat. And also, Swansea's key has a swan on it, but with the low resolution, it's not easy to see what's written on the little sign, so I wanted to take it up there for you, and it shows you that it says, "Where the fuck are my keys?" Seems a little bit excessive for a keychain, but that's fine. And then Daisuke has a Game Boy, or should I say a Game Kid. Really cool callback to 90s gaming. And what's really cool too is that if you take the camera behind the Game Kid, you can see that there are stickers of flowers on the back as well. There's also a World of Gaming magazine, and there's all sorts of different stuff that's written here. Like, for example, there's one that says poll, would you rather be meat or vegetable? And then to the left it says fresh meat doing what? Experts infuriated. And then below that it says opinion. Wrong organ was right all along. And on the magazine itself it says new demo, now on Game ID exclusive interview. And if you had a hard time reading what was on the gravestone, it said Semper Desiderari, which translates to always missed. Also, there's this scene here that you're not supposed to see yet, and the developers masked what is behind this weird smearing. If you take the camera behind the smearing though, you can see a scene that is obviously not to be shown yet. So unlike some scenes we'll talk about, this one actually dedicated itself to what was supposed to be hidden from the player. And now I just want to show you the entire game's ship in one shot. Well, this is everything that you're able to see before the crash. After the crash, you obviously get access to the cargo area with all the mouthwash. And the room for that is so massive, it's bigger than the entire ship. And then here's something that's resting above the player at all times, and I was curious, what the heck is the deal with this? It's attached to the player model, so whenever you walk around, you can see it walking with you. And of course, if you're standing still, you can see it breathing with you. So what is it? What is it doing? What's its purpose?
The texture that you're seeing floating above the player all the time is eventually a UI element that's being filmed by like a camera, and it's used to create something called a light cookie, which is like a texture that multiplies a light source by. So it means like you can effectively apply like a mask or like a filter over a light, which is what we're doing for the light gun. So every time you use the code scanner, every time you use it, you're seeing like that kind of barcode effect, and that's just what's hovering above your head.
And there's a couple things I want to talk about here with this scene where you're supposed to walk backwards from the vents. Apparently, there's no walls to this room. It's normally super dark, and when you have it completely lit up like this, you could see a weirdly textured, like, playpen that is massive surrounding the player. However, where you walk around and stuff like that implies that you're in a hallway of some sort. Now, then there's this little shrine to Daisuke, and there's a whole bunch of arms of Daisuke touching his weights, flowers, and game kit. But here's something that's really cool. If you take the camera underneath, you might notice some little strings. Now, what are these strings? It's actually Daisuke's arm, because if you go all the way to the bottom of these strings, you can find the rest of a teeny tiny mini Daisuke body. And then I wanted to pan the camera out when you're holding Curly, because when you do, you realize Curly's not that big, or maybe it's not so much that the character model is small, but it's like in a different plane of existence, essentially. And so panning the camera out will make him shrink or enlarge in ways that normal objects in the environment don't. And this one will mess with your head. Apparently this scene where Jimmy shoots Swansea, it's got that cool shadow casted look, but apparently if you could turn on all the lights, you'd see that the character models are not just the regular character models, which is shocking to me. No, instead, they're lime green, and the objects like the chair and the gun are pure white. And this whole scene actually is resting well above the graveyard. Yeah, that's right. I'm showing you a zoom out of the graveyard right now by association of trying to tell you where this scene takes place. Also, that scene where Jimmy is walking towards Curly, it's not too far off from where you were before with the TV and Curly hooked up to all those valves. And the warping in this game is kind of creepy in my opinion. One of the scenes that I thought, like, wow, I wonder what's going on behind your back when the characters are moving up closer behind you. And you can see here that everybody that was in their original positions just sort of warped to where you end up seeing them next. And the same could be said for Daisuke. When Daisuke comes to you about Anya, he first starts off in the void. He's actually completely unlit too. So first I had to light him up just to prove that it was Daisuke here. So here you go. And then when they do warp him into position for the scene of the game, you might remember that when you start walking around the ship, you turn around and he's just sort of like always a little bit behind you, but he's also never walking with you. You always have to have your back turned before he catches up. So I decided to show you what that looks like from another angle, and surprisingly, he's constantly warping. Also, you might remember that scene where Curly checks in on Anya, and then there's the revelation that Anya shares. And during that revelation, there's a cutaway scene where Anya's angle is shifted and she's in the void, like the darkness of space almost. Taking the camera out will show you that she's still in the ship, and she's actually still in the same position as well. It's just that the camera angle is shifted, and what's changed is that there's a whole bunch of black walls that get shoved and pushed all over the place to cover her up completely. That way the cockpit is never seen during this part. And then for the last few chapters of the game, I noticed that when you pan the camera out just a little bit, you see this weird mask, and I was like, what the heck is this? So since this is not an Easter egg, I thought it was appropriate to ask Jeffrey, what's going on here?
Yeah, so that used to be the scare that popped up when you were looking away in the, like, you have to look at the vent segment. So, like, when the player would look away, that would kind of rise up in front of their screen. Now, it looked really silly, so we switched it out for the Daisuke face scare we have now. But back then, that's how it worked, and I never ended up removing it, because when I switched out the code, the second you rip out the code that makes it rise up, the player never sees it again, unless they up the FOV, as some players found. So that's why we decided not to take it out at this point, because it's kind of funny.
Also, you might remember the inventory of the game, right? So if you take the camera and move it around during this scene, there's actually just a texture that's hiding the void. And that the objects, of course, are all 3D, but where they really are in the game world is several feet up into the air above the game map. And this is true anytime you play the game. Also, here's a little bit of immersion for you. During the scene where Swansea's banging on the door, if you take the camera on the other side, you can see that his character model is there, although he's not animated. His character model is essentially queued up and ready to go for when his character model does smash through the window and is about to get through. And then you guys might remember this very infamous scene where Daisuke crawls up into the vent. And of course, I just wanted to see what happens when you do. Now, for some of you intrepid explorers that use the no-clip version of this camera, you might remember that the void has no refresh, but with the camera made by Jade, we can see a crystal clear exact moment when Daisuke actually disappears from the scene. And then for this scene with the eyeballs and stuff, there's a lot to be shown out of bounds. I think just the fact that there's a giant floating eyeball in the void is pretty amazing, but there's also a ton of textures of eyeballs as well hanging out in the void. And then towards the very, very end of the game, you might remember this scene here where you can see the Pony Express mascot and the moon behind him. I wanted to take the camera to show you the immersion breaking here, that the texture of the moon is in fact just that, a texture, and that where you are is still inside the warehouse. Next up is the ultrasound scene, and if you take the camera inside the body when you have the ultrasound activated, you can see all the bones and also the fetuses of the ponies inside this model. Now, surprisingly, the color of all these things is bright red. And I know some of you are going to be asking, like, what about the actual fetus itself with the face and everything? Is that inside? And I couldn't get it to appear. I don't know if it's just something that's supposed to show up on the ultrasound itself only, but I looked all over when it's supposed to be in the scene and I couldn't get it to show up. And now it's time to explain how the looping hallways work. So this is from the very first chapter of the game, and you're walking around and you might notice that the hallways are just way longer than you would ever imagine. Well, the truth is that the hallway isn't all loaded in at once, and it's because it loads and unloads chunks of the hallway as you walk around. And also as you're walking around, those hallways have triggers, and then when your character walks past the trigger, it tells the game which part of the hallway to actually load in. And then for the Bizarro sequence, a lot of people want to know what it looked like when you zoom the camera out. And as you can see, that water layer is one giant circle, like massive, massive circle. Those little black dots that are on top of the circle, that's all the ladders and warning signs that you would normally see, and they are not tiny either. So that just gives you the idea of the sense of scale for this circle. It's really, really huge. Okay, so you might remember this scene where there's a whole bunch of staircases, and normally it's completely unlit around the staircases, allowing a greater sense of depth that the player can't see. However, if you make the lighting neutral, you can see where all the staircases start and end, and also the walls and the doors that are at the top of all these staircases. It still looks like a mangled mess even from this angle, but at least now you can kind of get a sense of what is actually in this area. And now we're going to start talking about faces, starting with the Curly faces in the final chapters. You can see Curly's face in the floor of this hallway, but if you pan the camera out, you can see that there's several faces that makes up this effect. And then there's the scene with the vents with the pony abomination, and you have to avoid it. You know what I'm talking about. But well, I think everybody knows that the infinite looping environment happens here in this scene as well. But just alone, you know, just like without looping or warping or loading in anything at all, the environment is still really massive, which is very surprising to me. Yeah, it makes a cross shape, and of course, you know, you can go in any direction you really want. I'm just surprised by how much of it is already there, though, before it has to do any sort of development trick. This one's kind of stupid, but I thought about it while I was playing the game, and I just want to show you guys that there's this scene where Swansea takes the little umbrella out of his drink, and I just want to know where it goes. In truth, the object just disappears once it's outside of the player. And I thought this would be hilarious. Obviously, there's no character model attached to you in most cases in this game. And so when there's the scene where you're cutting the cake with a knife, you can look at it from another angle and just see a phantom knife cutting into a cake. It's, when you really think about it, it's kind of funny. And of course, a lot of people want to know what happens when you combine objects, and this little contraption sort of covers up everything so you can't see what happens. I think to nobody's surprise, the objects that you put in just disappear and immediately get swapped in with the object that it combines into. And again, another scene where it should be no surprise to anybody, but there's this cleverly angled scene where Jimmy's covered up by the bottles of mouthwash. And if you take the camera out of that angle, you can see that there is no Jimmy model, leaving a fairly strong commitment to the fact that if you're going to be in control of the character, that character model is not going to be there. And similarly, a scene that a lot of fans want to know about, of course, is the scene where Anya locks herself in the medical room. So people that know about the no clipping go through the door, don't see anything on the other side. I think what we've established in this episode already is that we can restore things and see if there's anything that was actually in the code at least. And I did restore the medical room. This is what it looks like. There's no Curly, there's no Anya. There's nothing in the list of objects that I can summon Anya or Curly. They just don't exist in this chapter. So there is no Anya, but the medical room does technically exist. And then here's the scene where Swansea finishes off Daisuke. Normally the camera's angled in a way that you can't see the action, but this is what it does in fact look like. It looks as though you were originally meant to see this scene. The only thing that was a little bit off was that there was an instance of 2 axes at a certain point, which I mean probably could have been cleaned up pretty easily if the developers wanted you to see the scenes. So I think it was strictly a artistic choice to not explicitly show you this scene in the game. And then the termination letter is actually worded differently than what is told to you in the game. It's not particularly exciting like the monitor that I talked about earlier. So I'm just gonna show it to you. You can pause the screen right now if you'd like to read it out. But with that in mind, we can move on to the next scene pretty quickly here. In one of the last scenes of the game, you're going through this vent and you can see a giant Daisuke head in the vent fan. Taking the camera out will show you that there's multiple heads, of course, and there's also a light source on top of his head. Similarly, in that scene where you have to walk backwards and keep your focus on the vents, there are 8 Swansea heads on the other side of this grating, which is pretty cool, and some of them are even contorted a little bit to be squished. And we'll talk about the final scene here with Curly. You load him into the cryo chamber, and then Jimmy walks off, and it's implied that he shoots off a gun. First, I want to show you what happens with Jimmy. You can just see that he only walks a couple steps, and then he just stands in place. Obviously, the story implies something different, but taking the camera and showing you what happens is a little bit of a different story. And with Curly, you're in the first person mode. We talked about how the character model is never shown when you're actually in control of the character, but this is the one instance where that's not true. Taking the camera out will show you that Curly's head is missing and his neck is sucked into his body. It's incredibly likely that Curly's face is actually like the size of a needle tip, but unfortunately without the ability for me to mess with the field of vision, it's gonna be really hard to see that in the game. But again, I would probably take a strong guess that it is in fact there. And that's all I got for now. If you're brand new, I recommend the Bendy and the Ink Machine episode. That one also has its game's creator, the Meatly, guesting on it, answering some questions. It's a pretty good one. And of course, I recommend subscribing for more episodes in the future. If you're a super awesome fan, Patreon support will definitely help me weather through those early months of YouTube. It is rough. So anybody that can offer a little bit of support can go a super long way. I appreciate you. And to literally everyone, thank you so much. And I hope you have an amazing holiday season. Take care.